Well, hello. We're
Hello.
talking about liminality today, everyone's favorite conversation topic. Um, I this time I have charts, so I'm going to share some charts, but just so everyone gets caught up to speed. This is like this short-term uh, broadcast. We've been shooting for Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but we've missed specific days. Kind of between, leading up until basically Christmas. And so we're doing this as kind of a short run thing just for our own shits and giggles, but also it's a way to remind people that it's our fundraising season. And so just putting that little seed in there. Um, I'll talk more about where we're at with our goals for that later. But for now, I want to share this chart. Boom. Liminality. This is
Liminality.
yeah. So liminality it's a term used to describe it's like a psychological process of crossing a threshold or boundary, but which comes from the word limen, which is Latin for threshold. So moving from one state to another. But even though it was first applied to psychology, it kind of really gained traction within anthropology. So Arnold van Gennep, in his study as of religion as a cultural artifact, saw most rituals were, in a sense, liminal in that they helped individuals and cultures move from one status or social circumstance to another. And so when people talk about liminality today, they're talking about usually like rites of passage, going through a season of life that's like an in-between season, going from one way of being in the world to another. And, we're talking about it that way too, but we're also talking about it politically. And so here's this little chart up here, preliminal. You're encountered with some kind of thing that instigates. Then you enter into a liminal space where you integrate some sort of new concept or way of being, you discard an old way, and then it's a shift in your way of being in the world somehow. And then you reintegrate on the other side of that boundary. So the classic examples of this, if we're talking about rituals, things like baptism. Baptism is a ritual. It's a liminal process. You enter into either some sort of catechesis process or some experience, and then you come out differently on the other side. In Pentecostal circles, getting filled with the Holy Spirit would be a liminal experience. Within evangelical circles, that's sort of like anxious, accepting
The
Jesus in
altar
your
call.
heart. The altar call is a liminal experience. But there's also things like when they're talking about in this chart about this sort of encountering some sort of information that challenges us and then changing because of that, going through some sort of process. Psychologically, we can talk about cognitive dissonance, and then culturally, we could talk about cultural dissonance. There's things disruptive, and people have a choice. Things get risen to the level of choice where they can either stay the same or they can change. And so this is all of a very fascinating kind of like anthropological framework for starting to think about like, okay, how does personal transformation and social transformation? Oh my God, there's a kibby. That's a liminal. Holding a kitty is a liminal like experience pretty much every time.
Yeah, basically.
Because every time you pick up a kitty, but you're like anxious, and then afterwards you're not anxious. Changes the state.
Well, until your kitten decides that it's playtime and scratches you.
Yeah, or my cat does the little like kneading thing where it's like he's just kind of like poking. It's like I don't understand. And my cat has thumbs. He's a polydactyl cat, but those little thumb claws hardly ever get in there because they're like limp, little limp finger.
Yeah.
So you bring a little cat onto the screen and it goes off the rails.
It always does. This is what happens whenever I broadcast from the upstairs little work area. I end up with cats.
It's an occupational hazard.
It is. See.
So this is the thing. Like, so just taking a step back, this idea of liminality or a liminal experience or liminal space as a sort of container. when we're looking at social movements and how it is that people change, it seems like there's a number of different strategies. The thing that gets criticized a lot, um, the criticisms leveled towards the left, are often that it's performative or surfacey. So the idea is that there's a tendency maybe to use social shame, like "don't say that" kind of thing, as a kind of social conditioning thing, so that if you get enough people to sign off on stuff to create a new norm, then people will adhere to that norm. The criticism to that is usually it's not very transformative, that you just have a bunch of bigots who know how to talk like they're not racist. But the moment it becomes socially okay to be racist sounding or transphobic or homophobic or sexist, whatever, those will come back because there hasn't been a transformation. And I think there's a lot of validity to that. On the other hand, manufacturing transformation, the whole idea of winning over hearts and minds, it's a crapshoot. Like that doesn't happen very much.
No.
In a way, everything that we're doing at the Center for Prophetic Imagination is trying to figure out how to make it more possible for people to experience real transformation.
Yeah. You can't change hearts and minds, but people actually can change their hearts and minds. So it's about, at minimum, being a resource for those who are like wanting to do the process, or I don't know, like join our cohort to like prove us all wrong. I don't know.
Yeah.
I like my biggest time of transformation came from trying to prove another perspective wrong, and then I proved myself wrong.
Yeah, I've had those experiences, and my own interior sense of that experience was that I was curious enough to engage feelings of dissonance without shutting it down. And so this is important, like, because people have a very superficial way of understanding change. Like they think political positions, for example, are primarily intellectual, so that if they change their mind, then they've been transformed from liberal to leftist or from conservative to moderate. And that's not how it works, because if so racism was like, probably everyone watching thinks like, oh, I hate racism, and I hate racism, and I hate white supremacy. That isn't just a cognitive. I already know intellectually how not to be racist, but racism goes deep. And so I have to be open to interrogating myself and noticing dissonance, so that I can be a part of continual process of inner transformation. It's an ongoing and deep thing. And so even if people are, when people like say, oh, you're just preaching to the choir. Most people who are on the Center for Prophetic Imagination page already agree. I'm like, so what? They're not all liberated. None of us are that liberated that we can't continue to keep going deeper.
And the thing is, like, just the one topic of racism, and that's just, honestly, that's just one issue within. It's but it is a big issue. But whenever you take on something like that, you end up finding out like how deep it actually goes. Like most of our queer phobia in the West comes from a lot of racist things connected with colonialism, because Europeans had like this sexual ethic that we could go into that at a different time, but they decided to colonize all these other people groups and fulfill their like Pope ordained call to fill the world with Christianity, and they met other people, and they had different sexual ethics, like different genders. The number of like the number of actual cultures that don't fit into the cis het binaries that we have, like, it's pretty big, it's pretty significant. But because Europeans thought, because they were Christian and they had built cities, that they were civilized and knew everything, and so they literally would just try to make it extinct, and then like you end up having what we have today, where um where queer phobia is like part of our culture, but it's also like it's there because of racism. Like it, there's a lot of interconnection with oppression and stuff. And but that is like why that is why we keep saying like all these things. It's not just that like it's cool to call out, I don't know, call out shit, but at the same
Mm-hmm.
time we're like at least for me, whenever like I'm making posts and stuff, a lot of it is like, oh, I'm actually making more connections about how this is integrated even more in different areas of our society. And it's not just that I'm preaching to the choir. It's like, oh, I am actually realizing the thing that I am posting at this moment.
Yeah, and to me, like memes, like you people can criticize like bumper sticker kinds of thinking, like little slogan ears
Mhm.
kind of thing that a meme is. But really, to me, a meme is this little burst of potential disruption for people to raise a question. And to me, for me personally, I try to cultivate. For me, this is part of what I think of as mindfulness practice, being contemplative. It's not sitting for 20 minutes in silence on a you know on a little pillow. To me, it's noticing like whenever I have any discomfort rising, of giving my attention to it with a certain level of non-judgment. Same with longing. I tend to look at those as two poles of irritation and longing, and if the more we can attend to those things, um, and where it's coming from, the greater capacity we have for actual personal transformation. And I think that this kind of works at a social level too. Like if we can have narrative around, let's use Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders might be seen as a failure to people because he didn't win the election, but there have been few politicians who seemingly came out of nowhere and changed the narrative as Bernie Sanders did. And
That's true. Yeah.
and how we why I'm bringing Bernie Sanders up is because he gave a narration for people's social discomfort. So all of a sudden, you had a coalescing sense of people from across the spectrum that hey, the 1% and the corporatocracy is shitty and it's bad. And now that I'm paying attention to the fact I'm dissatisfied with where I'm at in relationship to the American dream, I can look at that narrative and say, you're right. Fuck yeah, Bernie. I'm a Bernie crat or whatever. Or I knew a
Mhm.
lot of conservatives that were into Bernie because he gave a narration, a way of
Yeah.
thinking about that helped explain why things felt shitty to some people. Now we can disagree with the depth of his analysis or his conclusions or any of that. That was the power of Bernie Sanders. It's kind of a social version of that attending to what is uncomfortable and what our longings are.
Yeah.
And so it raises the question of how individuals and groups who are like wanting liberation can go about creating space. Oftentimes in movement circles, we talk about organizing. It's just finding people who generally are on the same page and figuring out how to work together as a political bloc. But even within standard organizing, kind of the Saul Alinsky approach, where you go door to door and you talk to people and you find out their concerns, you're usually often providing a narrative in there too. It's like, maybe if you joined with us, we could get at that. And in my experience of Christian spaces, Christians suck at this shit.
Well,
We shouldn't. The whole premise of the church is that we're create a weekly container for people to gather together to hear a transformative narrative and engage in rituals that help us move from one way of being to another, centered around mutual aid and all kinds of stuff. Theoretically, churches could be great for this, but generally aren't.
well, that's because there's spoken doctrine and then there's actually lived doctrine.
Mm-hmm.
And the doctrine of we are already right is way too ingrained for those things that are actually meant to provide change to actually make change because it's
Mm-hmm.
like there's already that assumption. And this, I mean, this goes back, like I said, everything's connected. But this goes back into the idea. I mean, it's really connected to white supremacy, at least in the United States. Other places, it could be other issues, but at least in the United States, the idea that we already know what we need to know, that we've already figured out what God wants for our lives, that doesn't create change. That creates conformity, and change then gets turned into this idea of, oh, I went from not conforming to what we've already established has to be the right way. And that's not discernment. That's not anything of what the Bible is like actually trying to do, because the Bible is a wisdom book. And it's just I don't know. It, like, to me, it's like it just Christianity is like a way to worship a god by removing God.
Oof.
A lot of times. Not all forms. I'm not saying that. I'm using a general term, but like, yeah, I mean, there is a sense where uh, God is no longer needed in Christian spaces because we feel like we've already figured it out.
Well, and this is, I mean, just to pick up a couple previous strands that have been mentioned, that's part of Dorothy Sola's point and Beyond Mere Obedience, is that when she defines Christofascism, she's talking about this posture and orientation towards spiritual authority that then the spirituality is removed. And so you end up within a secular society, the same impulse with, it's like it's keeping the worst parts and then, but gutting all the spirituality and transformative power. And another strand to kind of pick up, when we're talking about churches and the lack of cultivating discernment as a real practice, we see this with, I think earlier this week I mentioned a book by Tom Driver, which I got the title wrong, but it's called Liberating Rights. And one of the points that he makes in that is that within Christianity, we have rituals that have become ceremonies. And the kind of the distinction there is that a ceremony, typically, the way at least he's slicing and dicing it, is a enactment that reinforces continuity, whereas ritual is about discontinuity. So you look at communion. It's supposed to be, the way the Apostle Paul talks about it, the Eucharist, is an economic thing as much as anything else. And so when you take up the cup and the bread, you are allowing yourself to be transformed in your relationships with these other people. But generally speaking, the way Eucharist or communion is done is, if you are on Team Jesus, you can take it. If you aren't, you won't. And so it becomes a self-reinforcing, self-referential practice of continuity. Same with baptism. Baptism is supposed to be a transformative experience, at least the way it was talked about. But generally, it's about continuity of the community. So all these practices over time that were supposed to be dangerous and transformative have become reinforcing of the continuity. And so you end up with churches talking about what they believe in a self-referential way and self-congratulatory way, thinking they've already got it and they just need to live into what they already think already, which is not a good recipe for transformation and growth.
No, it's not. By the way, I had to go on and tweet what I said. Yeah, I just tweeted it.
On the CPI page or on your page?
No, on the CPI page.
Okay.
I'll post it on Facebook and stuff.
Yeah,
I tweeted.
Can you reread it so I can know the words you just put on?
Yeah, just a second. I closed the app, so I have to get back into it. Yeah, Christianity is good at worshiping God by removing God from its spaces.
Yoink. I can't, it's shiny, but yeah.
That's shiny. But yeah, so you see it. I'll post it on Facebook too. I'm sure somebody will yell at us.
I mean, and this is the thing, like, we're not just instigating for its own sake. It's funny how I've been accused of being edgy so much, like not as much anymore. because I think maybe to a lot of people I'm too far gone at this point, so they don't criticize me the same
Maybe.
way as they used to. But as though I were just provoking for its own sake. People really don't like being challenged if they are generally okay with the status quo. But we only really have provocative memes because we think liberation is important, and we need to continue to exhort one another, even if we're all generally on the same page, to go deeper. And for those who aren't, I find it beneficial to provoke them into being frustrated and irritated because it raises their level of cognitive dissonance. So maybe there's a chance they'll feel harassed with their inner monologue and start interrogating things a little bit more, because that's what's happened to me. Now, of course, it always has the possibility of causing them to entrench deeper. But that's good too, in a way, because then everyone else around them gets to see them for what they are. That's good to know.
I mean, I see a lot, like when we do push buttons, let's be honest, we push buttons, but a lot of it, I think, at least my posture towards it, because I still identify as Christian. CPI still is technically a Christian organization.
Yep.
But claiming that status or claiming that tradition comes with a certain level of responsibility. And the fact is, if we are stepping into a Christian tradition, we are also stepping into the responsibility of like everything that is happening within Christianity. So like it's not just that we like we have Christianity right, and like all those like crazy far right whatever, they're not actually Christian. It's like, no, we are actually in the same tradition, and it is our responsibility to be accountable to each other and to make change within our tradition. And I do think that that is part of it's. I mean, that's some people's call. It's not everybody's call. Not everybody that comes through CPI's like cohort or classes and stuff, that's not their call either. But I think between the two of us, we feel a call to work within a certain tradition, within a certain accountability, to actually bring change in a way that we feel that the Spirit is moving us to make change.
Yeah. And
and that's why we push buttons.
Some people don't like that approach, but fine. We have to kind of have integrity with how we feel like we're supposed to move in the world. So just a reminder, everyone, comments are great. Questions are great. I know most people watch this after the fact. There's not a ton of people watching currently, which is fine. But I want to give a couple ads, little advertisements. One, we have our certificate in spiritual direction and social transformation. It's a 2-year program. We're just this spring is the end of our first cohort, and we're launching a new cohort in the fall. If you've thought, hey, I like the idea of being a spiritual director, or maybe not being a spiritual director in a conventional sense, you see yourself more on the social transformation side, that you are an activist who wants to cultivate spaces of discernment in groups and do some social discernment. This program is does help people do the standard spiritual direction thing one-on-one, but also kind of equips people towards whether it's discerning like social action or helping groups discern within themselves. So there's a social component to this, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Check it out. Go to prophetikimagination.org. There's links there. I mean, I think applications are open, and they'll be open till April 1st.
April 1st, yeah. But I think it's important to point out that this isn't just for people that are going to become spiritual directors. Because I think spiritual discernment like really works in a lot of spaces. Like it doesn't matter where you're going to be at. You're going to have, at least if you are not a spiritual person, you will probably interact with spiritual people. And you'll probably interact with a lot of people. And at minimum, the ability to discern within a lens of spirituality is at least going to give you like the lens to understand how our culture has developed within a sense of spirituality. So I don't know. I'm just saying there's a lot of use for this program outside of just the spiritual, like being a spiritual director. Like
Yeah,
it's not a yeah.
for sure. And this is kind of this secret sauce of the Center for Prophetic Imagination, is this idea that discernment, which we can talk about in a variety of ways. Ignatius talked about using the biblical language of discerning between spirits, but one of the ways we can think about it is that inner work at an individual and then collectively within groups to be able to understand what's going on under the surface, but then also social analysis and seeing it all as a dynamic system. And then asking, how is that stuff showing up inside me, and how is this stuff inside me and all of us collectively being broadcast in society, and how do we then open up space for meaningful action and choice? To me, that's what discernment is. And that, yes, spiritual directors talk about discernment on their one-on-one with the spiritual directee, but anybody who's been in a group facilitation process, anyone who's been part of planning some sort of social action, there's need for discernment tools in those spaces, and often that's not what's happening. So that's what the program does, is tries to show the different places for discernment and a contemplative posture, but with an emphasis on the social stuff. So you don't have to want to be a spiritual director to benefit from the program.
Yeah.
Kind of is broader than that, although that's the kind of the easiest primary application for someone who wants to like put up a shingle and make, have a practice. Another thing we have going in January, this is actually part of that program. Like, it's an elective for those who are in the one of the cohorts. But this is something people can take as a standalone. And in fact, if you're thinking maybe you want to do this cohort, be a part of the cohort, but aren't sure, taking this class by itself is good, or you could use it as one of your electives if you decide to join the program. So it's
so you could actually start the program early.
Yeah, without having to apply. You could take the class, and then if you decide to apply, then it counts as one of your 2 electives for the program. So the Holy Fool is a figure within Christian tradition that often seems crazy or bizarre, but there's a way that agitates people towards holiness. That's kind of what a Holy Fool is. I'm going to unpack that a lot more. And so January, the Thursday nights in January, we're going to be looking at historical examples, recurring themes, and then also the implications for a spirituality today of kind of holy foolishness. So I'm really going to unpack that. Been doing a lot of research and been fascinated with the Holy Fool tradition for a long time. So that'll be fun. And then finally, little thing. If we are trying to raise $20,000 by the end of the year, we're currently at 13,219. So we're getting closer to.
Like we raised since Wednesday, actually, I think.
Yeah, so we've raised, had another $500 come in. That was good.
Yeah.
And since we really started right around Halloween, and so we're in that final push. A lot of people give right at the end of the year, and so please support us if you can. Like, we're trying to raise $20,000 and trying to get 25 new sustaining members, basically people who commit to giving monthly, because that helps us budget to know there's a recurring amount each month. If you're watching this and you support our work at all, consider giving something and let other people know about what we're doing and encourage them to give. I know that's a lot to ask, but 'tis the season.
'Tis the season for giving, so give to us.
Yes. And just to be candid about it, like, this is not a ton of Christians, like really prophetic, spiritual spaces. There are not enough of them. And then there's not a lot of spaces where you have trans women kind of working as religious professionals. And as you know, Christianity has a history of not being very affirming. And so supporting us is also like keeping us in the Christian sphere instead of like having us be forced out, because it's harder to raise money now than it used to be. Because a lot of people don't like to support trans people.
But that is a good point. Like, like we talked about Christianity having a really hard time changing, but part of that has to do with money and control. And the fact is whenever there's an expectation of who can lead, and they're the ones that get most of the money, those who can lead and can make change generally don't have the backing. And so change doesn't come as easily.
Well, with that, I think we're going to log off for today. And next week's
our last week, right?
It's our last week doing this. Yeah. I think the theme next week will be resistance. Which has been kind of the theme all along.
Yeah.
But this will kind of double down on that and share more. I'm not sure exactly the angle we'll take. I have all weekend to think about it. So yeah, but it'll be kind of our wrapping up. And we'll probably announce a final push for some fundraising stuff. We're working on having a matching grant for that final couple weeks of the of the year. Yeah. So we'll see how we can work that out, and probably next week we'll talk a little bit about some of our 2023 plans with a little bit more depth.
Yep.
In the spirit of resistance.
We'll have stuff. We should have stuff being posted more too. Oh yeah, if you're not signed up for our newsletter, sign up for our newsletter, because that's where our blog post goes to first, and other news and stuff like that. Just mostly because it's posts can't just put everything out there, because that's just too much and people just scroll by. So, but if you want to know what's going on in just one thing, that's gonna be our newsletter. So yep. Sign up for that. And if you have Gmail, check your promotional folder tab thingy, because that's where it goes a lot of times, because it's a mass email.
Yep. Well, everybody, we'll see you next week.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.